Section 11.5, Quadratic Inequalities. Alright, in this section we're going to look at how the graphs of quadratics would look like if it's not a quadratic equation, but rather one of the four inequality symbols instead of the equal sign. So an inequality that's of the form y with one of those four inequality symbols, for example, could be y is less than ax squared plus bx plus c. So it still has to have that x squared term in order to be a quadratic, but now instead of an equal sign, it's going to have one of those four symbols. If you recall back earlier in the semester, we looked at graphing linear inequalities, so lines that had one of those four inequality symbols. Some of those lines, the inequality symbols would tell you whether to draw a solid line or a dashed line, and also we had to shade either above or below the line. It's going to be the same idea here with the inequalities of quadratics. It's just instead of a line, it's going to be a parabola, the curve. So if you recall, with the ones that had the equal to bar underneath them, those inequalities tell you to draw a solid line. So in this case, it's going to be a solid parabola we'll draw, whereas if it does not have the equal to bar underneath it, it will be a dashed curve. Okay, a dotted parabola. Either of the two greater than symbols tells us to shade above the curve, whereas either of the two less than symbols is going to be when we have to shade below. Okay. So let's apply that to what we already know about quadratics. Okay. Looking at our first example, we have y is greater than x squared minus 4. So first thing we know in a quadratic like this, it's a positive x squared. So we know which way the parabola will open. That's going to open upward. Okay. So it's going to have a U shape because the parabola will open upward. Also, because there is no middle x term, there's an x squared term and a constant. That constant on the end, the minus 4, is where it's going to cross the y-axis. So we actually know that this parabola, the vertex, is going to hit down here at minus 4, but then open upward. But before I actually draw in the parabola, we have to determine, is it going to be a dashed curve, a dotted curve, or a solid curve, and then whether to shade above or below. And that's where you go to the inequality symbol. It's greater than. A greater than symbol from our kind of chart up here tells us to make a dashed line and shade above. So rather than a dashed line, we're going to make a dashed curve for our parabola. Okay. And then also to shade, we have to shade above. I'm going to slide this over. And when you do this problems in my math lab, they're all going to be multiple choice, so that's really all you need to know, is that it will look something like this. It's going to be a dashed line, or a dashed curve, making this parabola. Okay. And then we're going to be shading everything above, which would be everything inside of the parabola, like that. If it was to shade below, it'd be everything outside of the parabola. Alright, so we're going to use that same approach for all of these examples. Looking at the next example, we have y is greater than or equal to negative x squared plus 6. Okay. So this one is a negative x squared term. So because it's negative, we know this one's going to open down. So this is going to look like an upside down U. The plus 6 on the end tells us what our y-intercept is going to be. So it tells us it's going to cross here at a y value of 6 on our y-axis. okay, positive 6. Then we look at the inequality symbol to determine whether to draw a solid or dotted line and whether to shade above or below. It's a greater than or equal to symbol, so coming back to our chart, that tells us to make a solid line for our parabola, a solid curve, and shade above. So it's going to be a solid curve, and we're going to shade above. Okay. So we know the curve's going to open downward. It's going to be a solid curve, so we can go ahead and just draw it like this. Okay. And shading above the parabola is going to be everything outside of the parabola. So above would be all up here, but then also kind of around the sides. Like it has a head of hair on it. Okay. So that's what that graph would look like. Moving on to our next two examples. We have y is less than x squared minus 2. Okay. Again, now we go back, we have a positive x squared, so that tells us this parabola is going to open up. And we look at the inequality symbol, which is a less than symbol. That tells us we are going to have a dashed curve, dashed or dotted curve. And less than tells us to shade below. Okay. And the minus 2 there tells us what our y-intercept is going to be. So this graph is going to hit through the y-axis down here at -2. We just said it's going to be a dashed curve that opens up. It's going to look something like this. And if we're shading everything below it, that again would be kind of below the curve, would be down here. So we're going to do everything, we actually shade everything that's outside of the parabola. Kind of like the parabola has a beard on it. Okay. And then our last example for this section, we have y is less than or equal to negative x squared plus 3. So once again, you look at the sign of the x squared term, it's negative. So that tells us we are going to have a parabola that opens down. Okay. And positive 3 is going to be the y-intercept of that parabola. So positive 3 up here on the y-axis at 3 is where it's going to hit through. And we look at our less than or equal to symbol to tell us what kind of curve it's going to look like. Less than or equal to tells us we're going to make a solid line or a solid curve. Okay. And also, because it's less than, we are going to shade below that curve. Okay. So our parabola is going to open down. It's going to be a solid curve, not a dotted curve. So it's going to look like this. And shading below the parabola would be everything inside of it. Okay. Like a full head of hair. And that is actually everything you need to know for 11.5. The assignment on that's pretty simple. Like I said, it's all just kind of multiple choice questions where you have to click what does the graph look like based on the equation. And just using the things we talked about, just determining if does it open up or down by whether it's positive or a negative x squared term. And then determining should it be a solid or dotted line based on the inequality symbol, and should you shade above or below based on the inequality symbol. And that's all you'll need for this section.